The morning he packed his suitcase, I was still counting the weeks on my phone, watching the tiny heartbeat flicker on the screen, and trying to believe that this fragile life inside me would somehow hold us together. Our apartment had started to feel like a hallway he was already walking out of, his presence reduced to shadows in corners and unanswered messages. He no longer looked at my stomach when it began to show, as if acknowledging it would chain him to a future he had already decided to abandon. I told myself that marriages bend before they break. That exhaustion can make people cruel, but deep down I could feel the shift in him long before the zipper closed on his bag. He said nothing kind when he left. There was no apology for the nights I spent sick and alone, no hesitation about the rent I could barely afford, no worry about the medical bills stacking quietly on the kitchen counter. He had convinced himself I was a weight dragging him down, a woman with no direction and no value beyond the inconvenience growing inside her. By the end of the week, I learned through mutual friends that he was already seeing someone else, someone glamorous, someone who could keep up with the lifestyle he believed he deserved. The divorce papers arrived before the nausea even faded, stamped with urgency as if erasing me was a race he intended to win. What he never knew was that while he was busy reinventing himself, I was living with a truth I had buried for years. I had walked away from a world of boardrooms and financial statements, choosing a simple life because I wanted love to be enough. My grandfather's empire had always felt like a story that belonged to someone else, a legacy heavy with expectations I wasn't ready to carry. I let my husband believe I was ordinary, struggling, dependent because I wanted a marriage that wasn't tangled in contracts and stock portfolios. Now, abandoned and pregnant, the silence in the apartment no longer felt empty. It felt like space, like a pause before something irreversible. As I stood there holding the ultrasound photo in one hand and the divorce envelope in the other, I realized I had nothing left to protect but myself and the child who hadn't even seen the world yet. He thought he had escaped a burden. He had no idea he had just walked away from a future that would soon make his new life look like a temporary illusion. The weeks after he left blurred into a routine built on survival, where every morning began with a quiet calculation of how far the little money I had would stretch. I stopped checking his social media, but news has a way of finding you even when you are not looking for it. Friends sent screenshots without asking, pictures of him smiling beside his new wife, captions about fresh starts and soulmates, wedding rings glinting in restaurant lighting that cost more than my monthly groceries. I stared at those images from the edge of my unmade bed, one hand resting on my growing stomach, wondering how easily a life can be replaced when it was never valued in the first place. Pregnancy sharpened everything. The hunger was louder, the loneliness heavier, and the fear constant. I attended doctor appointments alone, filling out forms that asked for emergency contacts I no longer had. Each time I signed my name, I felt the weight of the lie I had been living for years. My real last name, the one that opened doors in every financial district in the country, remained hidden in a safety deposit box I had not touched since my grandfather's funeral. I had promised myself I would never use it again, that love should not need leverage, yet here I was calculating hospital bills on a cracked phone screen. It was during one of those late nights when the city outside my window fell into a rare silence that I received a message from a number I had not saved. The words were simple, almost formal, asking whether I was finally ready to discuss the inheritance I had avoided for so long. My grandfather's legal team had tried to reach me for months, but I had ignored them, afraid of what reopening that door would mean for the life I thought I was building. Now, with eviction notices slipping under my door and a baby on the way, fear began to feel like a luxury I could no longer afford. The following day, I walked into a glass building that smelled of polished floors and controlled ambition, the kind of place I used to run from. The men and women who greeted me spoke my family name with reverence, not pity. They laid out documents that detailed the structure of the company my grandfather had spent 5 decades growing, a network of investments, properties, and subsidiaries that quietly dominated entire markets. 33 million was only the figure they were legally required to disclose, not the full scope of influence that came with it. I listened in stunned silence, realizing that while my husband had been rewriting his life in Instagram posts, my own future had been waiting, untouched, for my signature. I did not feel joy when I signed. I felt resolve, the kind that comes when something inside you finally hardens into purpose. I secured housing that same week, a modest place far from the chaos I had known, but close to the hospital where I would give birth. I paid my debts without drama, without announcing it to anyone who once watched me struggle. I let my ex believe his narrative that he had escaped a woman who would never be more than a temporary chapter in his story. Yet, quietly, behind the scenes, I began to understand the reach of what was now mine. I attended board meetings under a different name, learning which companies were failing, which leaders were careless, and which acquisitions were already being discussed. His new wife worked in an industry that depended heavily on one of my grandfather's subsidiaries, and I saw her name on a payroll spreadsheet long before I ever saw her face in person. The coincidence felt almost surreal, as if fate had been waiting patiently for me to stop running. Each night I returned to my new apartment. I pressed my hands against my stomach and spoke promises into the quiet. This child would never feel disposable. This child would never watch love walk out with a suitcase, and a smile meant for someone else. I was no longer the woman counting coins in a dark kitchen. I was becoming someone who could change outcomes with a single decision, and for the first time since he left, I did not feel abandoned. I felt prepared. By the time my son was born, my life no longer resembled the one my ex had dismissed so easily. I held him in a private hospital room, filled with quiet dignity rather than luxury, because I had learned that power works best when it does not announce itself. While I memorized the curve of his tiny fingers, my legal team was finalizing a series of decisions that would ripple through industries he and his new wife depended on without ever tracing back to me. The changes were subtle at first. Contracts were reviewed. Budgets were tightened. Entire departments were restructured under the language of efficiency. To the outside world, it looked like normal corporate evolution, but I knew exactly how every adjustment was squeezing the comfort he thought he had secured by leaving me. News reached me slowly, always through secondhand whispers, about delayed projects, sudden layoffs, and the quiet tension creeping into his marriage as the financial stability he had chased began to fracture. I never reached out. I never corrected the story he told about me. Letting him believe I was still struggling became its own form of closure. I was not interested in humiliation or spectacle. I wanted distance, safety, and a future my child would never have to beg for. Months later, I stood in the nursery. I had prepared myself, watching sunlight spill across the walls, realizing that the greatest revenge was not what I had taken from him, but what I had reclaimed for myself. He had walked away thinking he had escaped a burden. In truth, he had abandoned a legacy, a family, and a woman who finally understood that silence is not weakness. It is preparation.